get up my presentation. Let's see, and let me see if you can, or let me know if you can actually see this one.
Yes, we can see this. See your screen.
All right, and is it showing in full screen mode?
Yes.
All right, great. Well, with that then, I want to just simply start us out with recognizing that we have students here, we have faculty here, we have people who are working in the world of practice, and all of us in so many ways are probably constantly asking, how can we possibly be of use with the science that we're training for, or that is already under our belt and that we're constantly producing? How can we make a useful contribution to the problems that we all face now in the world? And I want to start us off with a poem, because I love bringing in different ways of saying the same things. But I also just simply love this particular poem. Many of you might know it, by Marge Piercy, To Be of Use. The people I love the best jump into work head first, without dallying in the shallows, and swim off with sure strokes almost out of sight. They seem to become natives of that element, the black, sleek heads of seals bouncing like half-submerged balls. I love people who harness themselves an ox to a heavy cart, who pull like water buffalo with massive patience, who strain in the mud and the muck to move things forward, who do what has to be done again and again. I want to be with people who submerge in the task, who go into the fields to harvest and work in a row and pass the bags along, who are not parlor generals and field deserters, but move in a common rhythm when the food must come in or the fire be put out. The work of the world is common as mud, botched. It smears the hands, crumbles to dust, but the thing worth doing well done has a shape that satisfies, clean and evident. Greek amphoras for wine or oil, Hopi vases that held corn, are put in museums, but you know they were made to be used. The pitcher cries for water to carry, and a person for work that is real. I think it's sometimes like that with science. You know, the equivalence of putting science in museums is to put them into journals that nobody ever reads again, or that no practitioner reads who could possibly use that information. So how do we, create vases, if you will, that are used to carry water, that make a difference in the world? That's what I want to focus on. And the outline of my talk is pretty simple, in that I want to think a little bit about, what does use actually mean? What is usefulness? How do we want to even think about that? And how do we create science that is relevant in a world that is faster and faster and really difficult, that does often not want to even hear from us? How do we make our science matter in that kind of a world? And then in particular, partly because you asked, but I think it's because it's a really important link in this chain of creating knowledge and using knowledge. How do we communicate that science in a way that is heard and used? And then hopefully there's some time left for us to talk. And I would assume that if you have questions, just put them in the chat, and then Katya or Shauna or somebody will help us weed through them, and hopefully we'll get to some of them. So let's start with this, thinking about use and usefulness. How might we be of use? Well, sometimes it's really, really helpful for scientists to simply provide a benchmark of, what do we know? What do we not know? To kind of demarcate that frontier of existing knowledge versus what is not yet known. Sometimes that can be super, super useful. And then, of course, to move that frontier forward. That's, pretty much the nature of science, and we're very familiar with it. But for many of us, that's not enough, right? We want people to actually understand the matters of the world, the things that we care about. and get people to engage with science, not just have that be that museum thing, right? That vase that no longer carries water, but to actually engage with it and engage in the thinking about the state of the world and in creating knowledge. We also often are really interested in creating better relationships between those of us who produce the knowledge and those of us who use it. And I don't make that simplistically about just scientists versus practitioners. Oftentimes scientists are users of information and practitioners hold very important knowledge. So the roles are not so simplistic, but the relationship between us is really crucial as a foundation for the use of knowledge and for the creation of knowledge, of useful knowledge. Many of us are interested in the question of how do we actually make information useful and use it then in practical contexts, at the same time that as scientists, we're still interested in actually doing interesting, science, right? Interesting research. Ultimately, probably use means that we want to see better decisions and better outcomes out in the world, right? We just don't want to, understand climate change, but we want to do something to reduce the causes of it and reduce the impacts of it. So just as one example, or in the health context that many of you work in, we might not only want to understand how COVID works, but we want to limit the transmission of that. And we want to get people back to work and therefore come back into a full life. So that's the kind of tangible differences that often drive us to go into science in the first place. So many different ways and nuances to thinking about being of use. Now, in some of my work, what I have found is that there are some more strategic or concrete ways to think about what is needed from science and from scientists. In the first instance, a practitioner, say, might have a very clear question or a policy problem or decision that they have to make, but they don't have the information to actually, inform that decision. So they come to you and they say, can you please answer my call? Can you respond to that request? And, sometimes you say, oh, that we already know that, and it lives on that shelf in the library, and here it is, and we can give it to you. In some instances, that means to do new research to actually answer a question nobody has thought of answering before. It's a really important function to respond to a very concrete request. In other instances, a practitioner may also very well know what they want to do, but the political environment might not be ready, or maybe people don't know how to make the new decisions. They need support. Maybe they need you to give talks, to educate the students, to train the practitioners in this new skill. So basically, the knowledge is there, the understanding or the decision of what they want to do is already there, but they need basically to create the supportive environment in which that decision can be made, and a credible scientist can be a very powerful messenger and supporter of that kind of shift. In other instances, a practitioner may not know what they want to do. They have no idea. They've been doing it a certain way that doesn't work anymore. And a scientist might come and say, you know what, here's some new idea. Why don't you try that? And you generate essentially a new solution, a new approach to dealing with a problem that exists. And the last one is a tricky one, and often one that people want to stay away from, and yet it is politically incredibly important. If you have a credible messenger, a scientist who can tell you, the way you've been doing that is not good enough. Here's the data that show it's not good enough and you could do better. That can be an incredibly powerful way in which a practitioner then can go back to their elected officials, to their fundraisers or whatever, and say, we need to do better. They said so, right? So you become in many ways a political supporter, but from that point of being constructively critical of something that is going on in practice. So these are these four functions, or these four services that we can provide as scientists, are quite distinct and have very important roles to play in the political process of making decisions, making policy, getting something done. So I just want to put them out there. There's not just one way in which you could be of use. Now, what do we know about under what circumstances science actually becomes useful? Now, this is not something that is inherent in the information, but it is an attribution that people who find science or look at science give to it. You know, they might say, oh, that's relevant, that one isn't. So the salience or the relevance, that is, you know, a really important thing where a lot of watershed get divided. You know, if you find scientific information is not relevant, not salient to what you need to do, sorry, I got other things to do. They might just simply turn off right there. If people, practitioners or other users might perceive your information to be credible because it was done by experts, it was you know, compiled in a really transparent way and peer reviewed and has all the hallmarks of being good science, then that gives it more weight. That's a really important thing. Legitimacy, another important attribution that a user might make on your science. And what that means is that, you know, they basically see the information you provide as taking account of their concerns, their values, different perspectives, the context in which you work. So it basically is something that they feel like, you know, it's robust sort of in a social or political sense. And those three are really crucial, but it's not enough. The next sort of criterion, if you will, that makes something useful is if you actually solve a problem they have. If you make their lives easier. If you just complicate their lives, they may say, well, thank you very much, but I don't want to hear from you about that. And the last criterion about iterativity, in other words, that you can easily update it, that you can, you know, move new information relatively easily into the decisions and the frameworks in which you make policies or decisions, is another really important piece. If you have to like reinvent the wheel every single time, people might not want to hear from you. Now, what does use mean? I want to just, you know, be really clear about that. There are many different ways of using information. There are these very practical things, like where people, you know, this is the situation with being being supportive or being responsive to a practitioner's need. So they have a decision in a practical situation or decision context, and you are directly moving your information into that. They can use whatever numbers you provide, whatever maps you give them, whatever model results you give, they can move that directly into it. It helps sometimes set research agenda, or you know, is very helpful in public or professional presentations, and there is a practical use. They need that in the briefing, in the speech, in the testimony, whatever, in Congress right then and there. There are more symbolic uses where essentially your science just is sort of a backup for something that people want to do. They draw on your information or on the authority of science because people know that that is something that has weight in a decision, compared to other kinds of knowing or other types of information that is not as well established. That's a really important use. You might say, well, they didn't pay attention to the details. Maybe so, but your science and the weight of that science is important in the decision-making process. Many practitioners that I'm familiar with simply look at your science to educate themselves and be smart and inform their thinking. And it's not in any concrete way, you know, part of a decision-making process, of a policy-making process, or of a specific decision. It's just they stay up to date and it informs their thinking. Just this morning, I was on a call with Standards & Poor's, who are trying to start thinking about how do we measure adaptation progress and success. And you know, they just basically asked me, help us to think about this, which is a really incredible invitation, right? And so they're just now in the process of educating themselves, and it may very well shape where they go with setting credit ratings and things like that. And then the last sort of piece around it, and that goes back to this issue of relationship building, social uses of information, networking with the information, networking between practitioners and scientists and advocates and all the people who have a stake in a decision. And very much that this trust and social capital building that goes along in that through collaboration. So those are really important ways in which you can be useful and how your information or your science is used by people in the world of practice. So I want to say, given that that's already what we know, how do we now do that in a world that is accelerating in many ways? And in the climate context, how most curves look exponential, right? The temperature increase is going to go up faster. The sea level is going to rise faster. We're going to get more and more extremes more frequently. They're going to be worse. Like, how in that world can we do the kind of work that I just described? And to do that, I want to sort of put in front of you this conundrum, which is a real one. It's not just a hypothetical one. And that is that given the pace of the world, there is a growing need for fast answers. And at the same time, scientists say, well, with so many things changing and in such chaotic ways, we need more time to understand. So one wants it faster, the other one wants more time before they can give you an answer. Doesn't that just mean that there is a risk of science becoming completely irrelevant to decision-making because it's busy trying to understand the chaos that's unfolding? And isn't there a risk of decisions then being made in an uninformed way or made too late and you just missed the boat? And maybe then therefore there is more damage, more disaster, more, maladaptation, whatever. That's the real world problem that we're now facing. And I think it really deserves questions about how then do we interact between science and policymaking. There is a long history of thinking about how we interact at that science practice interface. This is, what I'm going to walk you through in the next few minutes here, in the next few slides, is really a very brief history of sort of this thinking and how it's changed over time and what we've learned from it. Originally, and I mean originally as in like starting after World War II, Vannevar Bush was sort of a leading voice in shaping how to think about that. The contract between society and science was essentially society pays taxes, gives science some money, science goes away, does its research, and then through this linear process that you see depicted here, somehow it trickles its way to eventually coming back to society, offering some kind of societal benefits. But it was basically, give us the money, trust us, we'll go and figure out what's important to know and we'll send you the results, see ya. That was for a long time how we thought about this interaction. Now, that has changed over time. And I guess what I want to show you here is that over time, we've sort of recognized that maybe that's not the only way we ought to do science. In fact, there's sort of these two modes that we have to address at the same time. One has to do with how relevant is our research to producing generalizable knowledge. In other words, that is sort of independent of any specific context, that holds really solidly true. And on the other hand, how relevant do we want to be in a specific or immediate application? And based on that, there are essentially 4 different types of science that many have discussed, and that has moved us to a different understanding of how to interact at the science policy interface, practice interface. One where we're essentially, we don't care whether it's relevant to anything in particular, and we don't care whether it's, producing generalizable knowledge. You might call that tinkering. That's not even real science, right? But if you want to basically minimize sort of this immediate application, but produce something that is, generalizable and it's basic research and it's very much just focus on developing theory without concern for how it is using society, then you're really in that upper left quadrant there of, what Niels Bohr has sort of is stylized or symbolizes this pure basic research. On the other hand, if you're really not at all into developing generalized theory, but you're very much into applying your research to one particular problem, then you're really in Edison's quadrant here of pure applied research. And then there is this fourth quadrant, which has been called Pasteur's quadrant, or the use-inspired basic research, which is basically the idea that, you know, oftentimes we have an application-driven question that leads us to ask some fundamentally new questions in science. And that's really important type of research. But it's in each one of these corners, you can see it's a very different way of thinking about how you relate to society and the practical problems that a practitioner might have. Many of us who work in this field find ourselves more in either Edison's or Pasteur's quadrant of trying to solve problems and at the same time advance knowledge. And how to do that? When you work at that interface in that more applied and more stakeholder concern driven environment, is a very different mode of doing science. It means that you shape your questions and integrate and create knowledge together with the people who care about the answers. So not just with other scientists, but with the people on the ground doing that kind of work, fully acknowledging that they too have important knowledge and data and information that is needed to not only shape the research question, but to produce the knowledge together, validate it, interpret it, and then bring it back to society in a way that is actually user-friendly and usable. So a very different mode, what we call often transdisciplinary, engaged, collaborative. There's slightly different emphases in these and different nuances to that, but that's the general notion of that kind of work of research. And it implies there are different degrees, if you will, of doing that. One is where you simply just link, what science produces to the people who might use that information. In another instance, you might call matchmaking. It's really connecting the users to frame the research question, interpret results. So there is sort of that end-to-end connection, but they're not deeply involved in the process of producing the knowledge together. Whereas in collaboration, there is more of that. And in co-production or in co-producing, you almost hand the challenge of producing knowledge over to the people who are ultimately involved in using it. You're essentially just there to build a capacity and empower them to do that. So you can see that there's a degree of difference here, and it has different implications for how you might manage the interaction between science and practice. You know, in the first instance, you might just simply have somebody who is a good communicator and dedicated outreach capacity to communicate your science. In the next instance, you're more interested in maybe occasionally engaging the researchers with outreach staff or boundary organizations or with the people on the ground. In the third instance, you might actually formalize that interaction through boundary organizations, as we call them, who actively manage that interaction and on an ongoing basis. And in the last instance, you might really shift to changing institutional structures and processes that enable this ongoing engagement and empowerment of knowledge co-production. So very different implications from a interaction point of view, from the role of the scientists, from power dynamics, money, institutions that goes into this. One of the things we've seen, and this is work by my colleague from the NERRS Science Collaborative, James Arnold, who has looked at the degree to which funders can actually influence that. And over time, we have seen sort of that funders can, by simply asking for this type of more intense interaction between producers and users of science, we have seen that there is a growing interest in working in this mode too, in this co-production mode that I just defined. So I'm not going to go into great detail here, but just to simply say this is happening. This shift is absolutely happening because it's simply been found that when people, the more they work with each other, the more there is trust, the more there's capacity and skill in using science in decision-making. So there's a really important shift, and I encourage you strongly, if you're just beginning your scientific career, to seek out projects and opportunities to learn how to do this well, because this is really where things are going. Now, I want to pull out a couple of lessons of what we've learned from this, which is essentially that, if you want your science to be considered in decision-making at all, you need to address those core attributions of credibility, relevance, salience, legitimacy, and I didn't add here, but efficacy and iterativity that I mentioned before. It's a very important thing. Now, in order to do that, you need to increase the usability of scientific information. And that means you have to build a shared understanding of the problem and the decision context with the people who are living it on a daily basis. It's not just tailoring, but that's a core piece of that, right? It's also that your science comes back in a timely and reliable fashion, that it comes in a format people can use. So it is efficient for them. They don't have to, like go to get another degree before they can use your information. You need to improve their efficiency and their effectiveness. And in order for that to happen, you really, basically need to enhance or if you want to enhance the likelihood of them actually using that information, the more you interact with people, the more skill you build among the users, and they see that it's not as risky to use that information. In fact, that it benefits them more, and they trust you that, that you're not going to lead them off, the more likely they are to actually use the information. Now, the last bit here, and trust is already mentioned, trust is probably the absolute core to making that happen. There is a mutuality in your interactions. People understand that you are well-intentioned, that you're competent, that what you give them is good and solid and robust, that you follow through on requests, and that you give them time, and it takes time. And here lies the crux. Remember where this started out? We don't have time, right? This all, what I just laid out, what we've learned over time of how to do this work well and increase the possibility of getting information used takes time. Now, it's the one thing we don't have in an accelerating world. I want to bring in this African proverb, which I just love. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So the want to go far, go together, that's kind of what I just laid out, but it sort of, goes against this notion of going fast, right? I can probably do a lot of projects a lot faster and do that by myself, but it's not going to be very useful. But if I want to actually be useful, then I have to go together, and it actually will go a lot further. So the question then simply comes up, how do we accelerate this interaction, right? If we still want to be useful, go together, how do we accelerate? There are ways to speed up the delivery of usable science, and there's certainly ways to speed up decision-making. And then there's a whole bunch of things we can do in the middle in the interaction. I just want to put this here as a list that you can look at. I mean, whether it is, on the instrumentation side, we have better monitoring to see what changes are happening, that we develop methodologies to assess those changes more rapidly. We use, big machine learning, big data, working in partnerships and well-established, that takes some time initially, but once you have them established, and it saves you time later. Whether you maybe have decision makers in your scientific programs, in your research programs, to help you learn much faster about what's needed, or simply to train people like yourselves in doing this kind of transdisciplinary work. Those would be all useful ways on the science side, how we can speed things up. Same thing, there's a whole bunch of things that decision makers could do, whether it's reducing red tape or streamlining decision-making and regulatory processes, permitting processes, removing funding barriers. Oh my God, we could have a long conversation about that piece by itself. Having cross-agency, cross-sector, cross-scale collaborations would make things, again, initially take longer, but save so much time later. And, you know, same with capacity building on that side. What if you had an embedded scientist in your agency? Oftentimes science divisions are somewhat siloed from the people who actually make some of the more day-to-day operational decisions. So what if that was more integrated? And then finally, we could do a lot more on that interaction, right? Those having these boundary institutions established that sort of help that interaction and facilitate the interaction on a much more frequent and useful basis. You know, helping with what's most important, helping remove some of the barriers, doing some of that training and capacity building, adding value to science by basically helping us see what's the best science out there, what's the best information, the best tools. You know, I'm just thinking about green infrastructure. There's like 40,000 tools out there. How is anybody in the world supposed to know which ones to use, right? So that's the kind of stuff that I'm talking about. We could have people who are focused on actually trying to figure that out because they have arms into both the science and the decision-making side. And then actually also helping with evaluation. Do we know what's working? Well, if it's not working, then how about, you know, basically improving our way? So there's a lot of ways in which it can help. Now, coming back to this question, you know, if we want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. What if we need to go far and fast, which is kind of the situation we're in. I think there is a model in nature that we could learn a lot from. It's not a perfect model, but I want to put it out here as one construct of how to think of how to organize ourselves to go far and fast together. And that model is this. Bees can go very far together because of a particular way in which they align themselves and move amongst themselves to essentially help, you know, get where they need to go without exhausting themselves. Imagine on the front end there, you have someone that you might call a decision coach, someone who helps a decision maker very specifically to make the best decisions, how to make those best decisions. Maybe in that instance, you need also skilled communicators who can bring the science and get it to the people in the most, you know, direct and straightforward ways. Generalists who understand the big picture, who are not the experts in the depth, but who are able to make linkages across different sectors and bodies of knowledge, really important. Maybe even those tinkerers would be really helpful. But then the next set of geese, if you will, that you need are people who can synthesize research, who are those boundary organizations, who are experts in how to make good decisions, who are experts in managing, you know, knowledge systems and integrating so much knowledge that's out there now that we're all overwhelmed by, right? But what if that was a next expertise that we need? Someone who can really bring that together for us. And then the next layer out, if you will, people who are good at scrounging the data that are out there, people who are really good at the use-inspired and applied research, maybe even citizen science to bring in more knowledge for more sensors, if you will, out there. People who are advocating that the science is made openly accessible, not just there for the people who can pay big fees online, right? And then we obviously need people who do innovative research, both on the social, the technological, but also the governance side, on the methodologies of how to do things differently. And then, yes, we do need the fundamental researchers and people who are into science education who teach us in new ways about what is all needed. And finally, we need, you know, anybody from professional societies and unions to funders and science advocates who support this kind of work. Now, they're all out there, but they're not aligned right now, right? And what if we aligned ourselves more strategically in this fashion? And that to me raises big question about then how we want to communicate. I'm gonna actually skip this one here. It's essentially, I'm happy to share the data with you, but it's what I just said about there's lots of geese out there already, but we're not aligned in the right way. And how can we do this? So if we want to not become irrelevant, and if decision-making is not, you know, supposed to go back to sort of a pre-Enlightenment era, then I think there's lots of ways in which every one of us, no matter, you know, where we feel most aligned or what we feel most called to do in that geese arrangement, there is a lot we could do. And in my mind, given the acceleration of science, it's really not okay anymore to just stand on the sideline and not care about that. I think as long as we care to make have our science matter, have it be paid by societal taxpayers, then I think we have a responsibility to figure out how can we more strategically align what we do with where it's needed most. And that brings me then finally to this question of communication and how to be heard. This is what we so often find, right? People don't listen to us, they might not even care, or they don't act on what we know. And so it's really important, again, to think about, you know, this in the context of the geese, the flock of geese here. Oops, this is just now working all by its own. Sorry about that. Anyway, apparently I'm moving on here, which is that there is a gap between, I'm sorry, I don't know why this is going all by itself. So I'm gonna just override that. What I'm trying to say here is that if you're a geese further back in the line, then your next person that you need to pay attention to is not the one in the front, the decision coach. Your next person might be right that geese in front of you, right? And if you're in the middle, then you need to pay attention to the geese right in front of you. So your audiences will change in this process depending on where you are in the flock. And you want to be sure that you align to what that particular audience needs, right? It's not that everyone needs the same thing, but what is relevant to them? How can you be responsive to them? How can you be supportive to them? That's the question that you ask. And what I want to bring in here is this Dutch saying, said is not heard, heard is not understood, understood is not agreed, and agreed is not implemented. It's a really, really wonderful saying in my mind, because it explains why there is that gap between what we, you know, communicate and why people may not act on it. So what gets in between what gets in the way between saying something and hearing it? Well, are they paying attention? Are they even showing up to when you're saying something? Are they tuned into the right channel? Or what gets in between being heard and being understood? Are you using language they understand? Are you making sense to them? Those are an important question, right? What gets in the way of being understood and maybe not agreeing with it? Is it resonating with them? Is it a high enough priority for them to pay attention? When they think about what you're saying, you know, what's the cost versus benefit of paying attention to you? What are the trade-offs that they have in their mind when they hear what you're saying? Are they bought in? And then finally on the, you know, what's between agreed and implemented, do they have a motivation to act? Do they know what to do? Are they able to do? Do they have the support? Are they empowered to act? There are so many things that, if you will, can go wrong between you saying something and someone acting on it. So that's really important. So what does that then mean? It means that effective communication is not just about you throwing out your information, talking at people, or knowing what to say, finding the best language. Those are important things, but they're not enough. What you really need is to think very carefully about your audience, that geese right in front of you, and how that geese is aligned to the next goose in front of them, right? And then developing a strategy that aligns this audience with goals that they have, particular level of engagement, ways of framing that matter to them, that resonate with them, thinking about all the different communication elements, that what you say, the graphics you show, the results you show, whatever, the channels you use, all of those things, and the messenger. Maybe you're not even the right messenger, but maybe your friend or a colleague or somebody is, right? So it's really that Rubik's Cube of aligning all these pieces in your strategy to make the communication actually matter to the goose in front of you. Now, again, this is, I just want to put that up there as a way of connecting. And maybe just to remind you, communication, if it's not about delivering information, what is it really about? Communication comes from this Latin word communion, actually, to impart, to share, to connect, to make common. Think about that. It's not about delivering information. It's about making something common between the two of you. So how do you align yourself with that goose in front of you in a way that both of you can fly more easily, if you will? That's what communication ought to be all about. Now, I want to put this here in front of us, and if we had more time, I would ask you about this in the chat box. I think we don't have enough time, but imagine for a moment here, so forget the chat box here, but imagine for a moment here, what would make you walk across this bridge? Anything? Possibly? And what, if anything, would stop you or would make you hesitate? What would get in the way of you crossing that bridge? Think about that for yourself. In my mind, this symbolizes what gets in the way between communication and behavior, whatever the behavior is, the change that you wish to see. Somehow the communication needs to enable people to walk their talk, to make that connection over all the treacherous terrain and with inadequate channels, if you will, inadequate bridges between you. That is the task that you have. So how in the world can you make that connection, that crossing, a little easier? In all the work that I've done on communication, I bring it down to a very simple formula. And you can complicate this absolutely, but I think if you don't address the pieces that I'm just putting out for you, then I don't think it's going to work. So here's the simple formula. If you want to connect the communication on the one hand to an intended outcome, an intended response or change, you have to elevate or maintain the motivation to make that change and contribute to lowering the barriers or resistance to doing so. So it's, if you will, the two ends of the bridge where the communication and the social change on the two sides of the ravine, and in between is what would make you go across it and how could you lower your resistance or the barriers to staying basically on the other side. So that's what you need to figure out. And it's not up to what would motivate you or what your resistance is. It's what's whoever you want to address, that goose in front of you, whatever is their motivation, whatever is their resistance or their challenge. If they don't know what to do, then that's what you need to address. That's how you get to buy-in. Basically those two pieces is what you need to address. And it depends on, again, wherever you are with your audience. To do that, my biggest advice to you is to come as what I say as a friendly communicator or as a friend. Imagine that. If you first connect with someone, what would you say to them? Especially these days, how are you doing, right? You would connect with them as people before you would say anything about your science. You would validate them. You would affirm who they are. My God, it's such a challenging time and you're doing such a great job, right? You would appreciate something that they have accomplished in the past and then speak to the things that they care about, what they treasure, what they value, what they aspire to. That's how you know what to link, what you bring to them, whatever information you have, how you connect it to something they deeply, deeply care about. And of course, you have to sympathize with their struggles, their concerns, their worries, their barriers. You need to address those in how you communicate and how you enable them, empower them, and help them. Sometimes that means you need to work with partners to, because you don't have all those answers, but that's really important. You don't have to do this alone. Basically, you connect the climate action or the action you want them to take, the use of information you want them to take on, to something they already do or can do, and you tap into their passions, their curiosities of how to, why to care about this, right? And then you don't just say, okay, here it is, see ya, because in climate change, things are pretty darn dark. You need to leave people with hope and the sense that they can do this and they're not alone doing it. So I want to close this with just a very brief slide here on on the ingredients of what it takes to create hope. There are 7 ingredients, and I could talk an hour about this just about itself, but I just simply want to say there's got to be a vision of something that we can work toward together. There's got to be a path toward that and a role that I play in that and that others play in that, right? So that you have a sense of doing that together. There will be setbacks. You will achieve goals and people will say, okay, we did that, now we can go home. No, they have to keep going. So what are your strategies at that point? And very much link that to the deepest motivation of why people get up in the morning, this call on their highest self. When you do those things, connect that with the seriousness of the situation, a diagnosis, you will give people a deeply authentic and anchored sense of hope of how to keep going. So it's a difficult thing. This is not a one-time, thing you just say once and then you can go home. This is something you have to bring people back to again and again and again. And there are, I'm going to skip this because we have not enough time, but I want to just say there are a whole bunch of considerations that we can no longer avoid addressing in our engagement and communication. And that has to do with how equitable and how much we work in an anti-racist way toward justice. We have to make this information accessible and make it open and accessible to people who have been disadvantaged for way too long. So I just put this up here and happy to talk more about that. So with that, if we have just a few more minutes, I'll just open it up to questions and I'll stop sharing and we can just chat.
Great. Thank you for that great talk, Dr. Moser. So as Dr. Moser mentioned, the floor is now open for questions. You can either ask your question or put it in the chat box.
I'll start with a question, Susie. First off, great presentation, and I really appreciate that you addressed the role of trust that needs to be developed between those providing the science and those that can best benefit from it. But that's one of the challenges we have, and oftentimes we don't look like those that we are trying to work with.
Yep.
Or we don't talk like. That's a real challenge. The other challenge we have with academic science, and I deal with this quite often with young faculty, is that in academia, the reward system, i.e. what the tenure and promotion folks look for, usually doesn't include the use or the usefulness of science. They count how many publications you got out of it. So what can we do to help address that challenge that we face?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a really great question, Dwayne. And, I would say, as much as I just talked about sort of science and practice as if it's the thing outside of academia, what if your practitioner is your administrator in your institution, right? And you apply every principle I just said and every communication principle I just laid out in the exact same way to the people who need to make those changes internally. Now, it's not just within your university, right? It's within the professional societies, it's, in the larger academic environment, it's in the publishing arena, it's the funders. So I think there are, in many ways, it's a system problem, right? Where change needs to happen at all these levels. And the good news about that is that, there is change happening at all these levels. I mean, we see changes in funding programs and in the incentives the funders set. And I'm telling you, that's going to be one of the biggest drivers of this. It needs to, address at the professional society level and the standards of, what counts as good science, if you will. I mean, there is now a huge body of work on, science, technology, society studies, on transdisciplinarity, on collaborative science. I mean, it's beginning, right? And I would just simply encourage everyone to, wherever you are called to work on which end of this problem, just keep at it and find the people who work like that. Work through funding programs that already support that. If you can bring in the money and get good publications out and be useful, that would be ideal. I mean, some of us create our careers around that and it works. But I think you have to think about it in the exact same way as what I just laid out in the sort of, applying the principles of communication, engagement, and interaction and trust building with the institution. And look for the leaders, people who are open and willing to do that. It's, don't start with the people who are just so fundamentally opposed and not interested in even hearing you. So start with where there's goodwill, at least. Still hard enough, but it's a place.
Okay, great, thank you.
Katya, are you looking at the questions or do you want me to pick? How do we?
Well, we have a question about slide deck. Will we be able to share that?
Yes, I'm happy to send it to you and you can share it out to, wherever this went to.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Other questions?
Please feel free to unmute yourself if you want to ask the question or just type it in the chat box.
Hi, Susie. This is Betsy. I wonder if there are any examples of success where you've really, you've seen the full formation flying overhead.
That's a great question. I haven't seen all of it yet, but I see clusters of geese. And I'll tell you where this started for me, and where I'm beginning to see maybe some of that changing. I was inspired to think about this in the context of Alaska. I was doing some work with the RISA program up in Alaska, and I was doing an evaluation of their program and interviewed a number of different stakeholders, how they perceive the work of that particular boundary organization. The RISA program is, a program that tries very explicitly, for those of you who don't know, to link science and practice, and they're probably, along with the NERRS program, the sort of prime model of how to do this work well. And in the interviews that I did, I spoke with a native person in Alaska who lives in northern Alaska, and she was, when I sort of, came around to the question of climate change, she just started yelling at me. And she was yelling at me as in this exasperated way of, why are we talking about climate change? And I was like, this is my job. I'm supposed to talk to you guys about climate change. And for her, it was the ridiculous idea of talking about climate change is that it sounds so benign. She said, we are living through absolute and utter system collapse, right? So this being the sort of front or the always 20, 30 years ahead of what the rest of us will expect, we're living through utter system collapse. Now in system collapse, what do? What's useful science, right? You need someone who helps you right then and there with a decision. You need to have somebody who builds the capacity of people who can make fast decisions, who know how to get answers. You need people who are absolutely skilled communicators in bringing all this complicated science down to what people need in whether they're firefighting, whether they're looking at ice breakup, whatever. So in that instance, I actually saw how that RISA in that region was beginning to shift itself into the formation of a goose, essentially. So, or of a geese flock, it was really a really interesting observation of the need for rapid response, being something that this organization was beginning to address and what services it offered. So it's not the full Monty, but it's a bit. Other questions? I know we're almost at the top of the time here. Any examples of success in this regard in the IPCC? Oh, well, I haven't been involved in the IPCC in the last few years, so I cannot give you a good update on whether or not I see it happening there. I know the IPCC has tried to shift its communication. It's tried to shift some of its processes and who to bring in and what science can be cited. But oh, that would be probably one of the last places I would look for that change. It's too archaic, and it's really sad actually that it's not changing more rapidly. But there are some, you know, I think there are some processes at the highest levels where you see that happening, where even IPCC results are then translated by advocates and coaches into something that UN level decision makers can use. But that's not the air that I breathe on a daily basis. So I don't know exactly what it looks like in the UN. So I can't tell you whether that's changed enough or rapidly enough. It's not my impression, but I don't have the full picture. Let's see. There's a question here from Doug Sampson. What would your talk look like if it was given by an experienced, thoughtful, and dedicated decision maker and it were being delivered to an audience of decision makers? Are there professionals working on this issue from that side of the spectrum? You know, that's an interesting thing. I actually believe there are ways in which the practitioners are organizing themselves to learn more rapidly and to exchange their learning with each other more rapidly, and then hand back and forth their learning in really tangible ways. So for example, the cities have organized themselves in various formations to learn more rapidly from each other and with each other. They, you know, once they're done with their work, they hand over model ordinances and things like that. So I think there is a way in which they too are trying to self-organize into a more rapidly adaptive and learning-oriented way. But I see that the cities, for example, that I'm mentioning and the states happening at the same time, I see that among the most advantaged and progressive and not necessarily being always inclusive. So it's, you know, there's no perfect answer on any of this that I'm aware of. If there is, I would love to hear from you all what you see, but I definitely see ways in which people are trying to come into formations that are more supportive of faster learning.
Okay, I think we have reached the end of our time with Dr. Moser. Any one final question? If not, I will ask Katya if she has anything for the good of the order, any graduate student business we need to mention or anything before closing out the seminar?
We actually don't have any updates or announcements today. So.
All right, well, great. Let's give Dr. Moser a virtual applause for a great talk.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. And you take care, stay safe.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye, everyone.